Today, women's cycling is at an all-time high. The bicycle has long been a symbol of gender equity. In Europe, there is now a female version of the famed Tour de France. There's also now a female version of the cobblestone classic Paris-Roubaix. All of these events for women have come about in the last few years. Yet in many cases, the bicycle and bicycle racing has been male-dominated. The fight for a women's Tour de France was long and arduous. While there had been a female versions of the tour in 1955 and 1984 to 1989, the Amaury Sport Organization, the organizer of the TDF, kept the TDF as a male-only event, even going so far as to threaten legal action to a race in France trying to use a name similar to the TDF for women. But due to sustained pressure in the 2010s on the ASO, which included public statements, increasing attention in women's racing, and a women's group riding all of the men's stages of the TDF, the ASO responded initially with a one-day event, eventually up to 2 days, called La Course by La Tour de France from 2014 to 2021. With decent success and with the help of a major sponsorship of Zwift, a very successful online cycling platform, the ASO put on an 8-stage Tour de France Femmes beginning in 2022. It occurred at the conclusion of the men's race. Even with a significant drop in viewership from 2022 to 2023, the 2023 version saw a French-only viewership of 20 million. Should be pointed out, the TDF Femmes is broadcast in other countries too, including in North America. The TDF Femmes is a success, though in large part because of North American support and pressure. In fact, North American women's cycling and cyclists have long been contributors to the world's biggest cycling events. The bicycle has long been held up as a symbol and tool of gender equity, yet in North America, women's cyclists' accomplishments have been largely overlooked. In this paper, I look at two of the most glaring examples of overlooked North American female cycling races and stars. Namely, I explore the career and race of the first American to win the Tour de France, Marianne Martin in 1984. I also explore the nearly century previous 1889 6-day bicycle race at Madison Square Garden, which was also female only. I argue that both cases were path-breaking, controversial, and worthy of more attention in the pantheon of women's sport history. Marianne Martin was the first North American athlete to win the Tour de France. She is often overlooked for her 1984 Tour de France victory, but she is in fact the first American victor. Martin was a late add to the US's Tour de France team. Before 1984, there had been a one-off women's Tour de France in 1955, but as Isabel Best and Queens of Pain, Legends and Rebels of Cycling chronicles, Felix Levitan, a director of the then male-only TDF, took a chance on putting on a women's Tour de France. Of course, as Best points out, this did not happen in a vacuum. The International Olympic Committee added the women's running marathon and women's cycling events in 1984. Also, while under the radar, women's cycling had existed for over a century. The US team was led by Betsy King, who had a much stronger cycling bona fides than Martin. Martin had only been racing for 3 years. To get on the team, she had to beg Eddie Borshowitz, the coach of USA Cycling, with the support of top male pro Stephen Tilford. Also, many of the top names in women's cycling had skipped the inaugural women's tour to focus on being in the inaugural women's Olympic Games. Thus, with 36 women, the 1984 tour took place in July. The women's TDF had 18 stages, which were shortened versions of the men's race. Interestingly, the women's stage race was run on portions of the same course and the same day as the men's race. Unlike the men's race, which was run on a professional trade team basis, the women's TDF was run on a national team basis. The Dutch team was on the attack for the first part of the race and held the yellow jersey until the mountainous stages. Martin initially decided to go for the climbing jersey, the famed polka dot jersey. You can see that here in the slide. Then on a stage to La Plaine, already in the polka dots, she broke away and the peloton group of riders let her go. She won the stage by 5 minutes and thus gained both the yellow and polka dot jersey. Despite attacks, especially from the Dutch team, she was able to hold the yellow jersey into Paris. Martin won $1,000, while men's winner Laurent Fignon, who is in the Renault Elf outfit, won in the hundreds of thousands. In fact, when Martin quit cycling 2 years later, she had to work 2 jobs to pay off her cycling debts. She thus became the first American to win the TDF. Greg LeMond, who is also in this picture, and was, it looks like, I believe, the white jersey winner in which is the jersey for the top rider under 25, but not the overall. But he is right there next to Marion. And he did not win until 1986, a full 2 years later. The combined men's and women's TDF lasted until 1989, when the TDF organizers dropped the women's version. Several versions of the TDF existed for women under such names as Tour Cycliste Féminine, and when what became the ASO objected, La Grande Boucle Féminine, which ran until 2009 with various degrees of success. As mentioned, under pressure, the ASO did a one-stage race called La Corsa from 2014 to 2021, and still under pressure to do more, started an 8-stage Tour de France Féminine in 2022, and that had more than 100 female competitors. Martin was also not the first North American woman to break onto the world stage of cycling. In its day, the 6-day bicycle race at Madison Square Garden was a world-famous event for men. At Madison Square Garden, the race ran annually or biannually for men from 1896 to 1939. The event often drew sellout crowds, gamblers, and thieves who robbed spectators. 6-day racing on bicycles evolved from 6-day pedestrian events. They lasted 6 days, usually 144 hours. No Sunday racing as to observe the Christian Sabbath. Indeed, the original Madison Square Garden became known as a sporting arena rather than just a place for shows by hosting pedestrian 6 days with a go-as-you-please format. It hosted these races in the late 1870s and early 1880s until interest in 6-day walking/running races faded in popularity. But in terms of a bicycle-only event, the women's race of 1889 was the first bicycle-only 6-day race. As Anne Hall has shown in her Muscle on Wheels, Luis Armando and the High Wheel Racers of 19th Century America, women were riding and competing on the bicycle in the 1880s, even during the high wheel era, when many have assumed it was too taboo for women to ride bicycles. Women were competing. Thus, in February of 1889, promoters held the first bicycle-only at the original Madison Square Garden, which was famously rebuilt with Stanford White in 1890. As M. Ann Hall recounts, the 6-day, 8 hours daily race began on the 11th of February, 1889. 12 riders lined up at the start. Riders included the famed Luis Armando and Elsa von Blumen, and newcomer Lottie Stanley. While Armando had trash-talked newcomer Stanley, Armando was not competitive, and Stanley rode, who is depicted here, rode over 624 miles to win the indoor event at Madison Square Garden. Reporters noted that the women brought in $10,212 of revenue, and Stanley received over $1,500 in winnings. While a women's 6-day would not happen at Madison Square Garden for several years, as Hall with high-wheeled bicycles in the 1880s and Roger Gillis and Women on the Move, the forgotten era of women's bicycle racing, women's long-distance professional racing remained popular through the turn of the 20th century before fading. Similar to Martin in the 1984 Tour de France, women also blazed the trail at Madison Square Garden. 6-day races for men started in 1891, and from 1896 ran annually and biannually until 1939. The 6-day race was popular in many places, and still is in Berlin, Germany. But in America, the format was associated with Madison Square Garden. Today, it may seem that women's professional racing is at an all-time high, which in some ways it is, but in fact, it has ebbed and flowed over the years. More to the point, North American women have long been on the international stage, vying and advocating for women's racing, and in some cases, blazing trails for men's racing in the process. Thankfully, the peloton size and television audience in 2022 were large enough that coverage of the TDF Femmes was largely positive. In 1984, there were more critics. Men's 1983 winner and later 1984 winner Laurent Fignon went on the record saying, "I like women, but I prefer to see them doing something else," end quote. As Isabel Best notes, 1960s tour star Jacques Anquetil went himself on the record saying, "I have absolutely nothing against women's sports, but cycling is much too difficult for a woman. They are not made for the sport. I am sorry to see women suffer. On a bicycle, there's always a lot of suffering." Also, as Best notes, of the 36 women who started, 35 finished. The one not to finish had a broken collarbone. This was perhaps not so surprising, as at that time, the sport's governing body, the Union Cycliste International, limited how far women could race. Nonetheless, all of the climbs the men did, the women did as well in 1984. The United States Federation would also not allow individual sponsorships for women. So while there was a resurgence of interest in Martin and her victory for a long time, the victory was lost to time. Nearly 100 years earlier, the story and interpretation of women's cycling was much the same. While there was some excitement over the prospect of a 6-day bicycle race, there were also critics. As Hall notes, the editor of Bicycling World and Law Bulletin went after promoters at Madison Square Garden and had this to say about women's bicycle racing. Quote, "When it comes to a question of women bestriding an ordinary high-wheeled bicycle and riding around a track for the purpose of being guyed by a curious public, then I want to go on record voting decidedly in the negative. I had thought that this type of cycling disgrace met its birth and death in the performance of Luis Armando, but alas, I was mistaken," end quote. The suppression of the rich history of women's professional racing is covered territory for historians. Perhaps the most apt article was by Roger Gillis in his, quote, 1890s Women's Bicycle Racing Forgotten But Why, published in 2019 in the Sport History Review. Gillis discusses 6 factors that have led to women's cycling from this period being overlooked and forgotten. Gillis gives reasons including suppression by the governing body, the League of American Wheelmen, which refused to officially sanction women's racing in the 1890s. Next, on an East Coast bias in the press and the prominence of local sports coverage, and for the majority of cycling history's pre-digital archives of material that can now be accessed quickly on the internet. He also cites gender bias as a reason. I think his analysis is prescient and on point. It is a bit disheartening to see the 1890s example largely repeated with the 1984 version of the tour. Certainly, the 1984 version occurred in the context of more well-known women's events at venues such as the Olympics, namely the women's running marathon and women's cycling events. Nonetheless, it seems with much more attention and infrastructure, there's a women's professional cycling league now, there has been increased interest in women's cycling history. These 2 examples show that North American female cyclists have been repeated trailblazers in the world of high-level cycling. I hope the trend continues. Thank you.